For Creamer Media's Polity, I'm Shannon de Ryhove. I'm with Dr. Greg Mills of the Brenthurst Foundation, who will be discussing the recent uprisings in Tunisia and Egypt and what this means for the rest of the African continent. Greg, what do you think has been at the root cause of the current uprisings in the Arab world, especially given that countries such as Egypt and Tunisia are not really very unequal societies? For example, if you look at the Gini coefficient rankings.
It's very difficult to understand fully what lies behind the unrest in both countries. I think it's fair to say there's a sense of anger, there's a sense of frustration and hopelessness which has now manifested itself in street demonstrations. There's a sense of anger over leadership which has not respected democracy, which has, in the case of Tunisia, which has enriched itself massively while its people remain relatively poor. It's also a result of a sense of anger and hopelessness over what's happened in Iraq and Palestine, and the fact that they see that their regimes which have led them have cooperated to an extent with the United States and its allies in those particular wars. So it's a whole series of issues which have led to the sort of street protests which has toppled Ben Ali and which threatened the government of Mr. Mubarak. But I don't think it's possible to specify just one thing and one thing only, because in the case of Tunisia and of Egypt, both those economies have done actually quite well over the last 2 decades, and particularly this decade, Egypt's economy has really grown remarkably, over 7%. It's made real inroads into unemployment. Again, however, there are problems of structural unemployment in Egypt. There are many young people who remain unemployed, who don't really have a chance of getting into the employment environment, who may indeed have a fair education as well at the same time. And for them, radical solutions become far more appealing. It's hard to say whether there's an Islamic dimension behind it. Of course, those who are protesting say that there's no Islamic dimension behind it because they don't want to, in a sense, scare Egypt's former partners or its current partners, including the United States, and in a sense create a lot of more tension around what is happening in the country. But there certainly is an Islamic dimension in terms of the support for the Muslim Brotherhood. A large number of supporters do have, in both Tunisia and in Egypt, do have associations with Islamic tendencies. It doesn't mean that they are undemocratic. It doesn't mean that they are radical in terms of what they're going to do with women's rights and everything else. But it is part of this equation in understanding why these events have happened. And of course, finally, they have fed off each other. You know, Ben Ali was first, then it's now happening in Egypt. Of course, the president of Yemen has said that he's not going to stand again. There have been demonstrations in Jordan as well. There seems to be something of a domino effect, which have, of course, led to these events, particularly in Egypt and other places. And of course, behind all of that lies the fact that you've got governments and people in power for very long periods of time, who, in a sense, have not, or were seen not to be accountable to the majority of the population. It's very easy to put blame on other countries for this. In a sense, what this may do positively is show to Arabs that, and to Arab leadership, that they are accountable to their own people. And it's not always the fault of the West for everything, or the fault of Israel. After all, it's not the West or Israel who encouraged Mr. Ben Ali to open a foreign bank account, or who stuck Mubarak in power for so many years, or encouraged him to have his son take over from him. That's got nothing to do with outside powers. It's got everything to do with the nature of the government and of the leadership and of the political class within these countries, who feel a sense of righteousness in terms of their policies and the way in which they have approached their accountability to their population. So it's a complex set of issues. How they turn out is perhaps the most interesting question of all, however.
What lessons could the recent uprisings in Tunisia, Egypt and other Arab countries have for Africa? Could the democratic impulse spread across the African continent?
It's again hard to say what the impact will be. Partly it's going to be determined by what happens in those countries. I mean, there's every sign now, although there are widening demonstrations in Egypt, there's every sign that Mr. Mubarak still has the support of the security forces for the moment. And even though he said he's going to step down in September, that he will continue to remain in power until that point. Of course, it could change very quickly, but so far he has stayed and he has in a sense faced off the street demonstrations. So, to an extent, the sort of democratic uprising phenomena of the Middle East will, and its ability to translate itself into Africa will, I think, be determined by its success or by its failure to a certain degree. It's not going to be a linear process, because what happened in Eastern Europe 20 years ago didn't automatically encourage similar events in North Africa or indeed in Sub-Saharan Africa. There's been a very slow change in a process of democratization over the 20 years. Of course, Sub-Saharan Africa has become far more democratic. There were just 2 multi-party democracies in the 1980s, and now there are more than 40 countries which have regular multi-party elections. But is this going to translate into an event, say, in Harare, which removes Mr. Mugabe because of his flouting of democratic norms and standards? I think that question is moot. That question is really only going to be answered by the leadership of the MDC and by Zimbabweans themselves. And so far, Sub-Saharan Africans have remained remarkably passive in the face of some of the most egregious governments that we've ever seen, not least in a place like Zimbabwe. So to say that this is now going to, lead to a democratic series of revolutions and people power protests of the sort that toppled Ben Ali and threatened Mubarak, I think is perhaps a little far-fetched given the history of Sub-Saharan Africa. It's tempting for political leadership who feels frustrated, but an awful lot has to happen in terms of taking their populations, which remain very patronage-driven, patrimonially linked to leadership, divided by class, ethnicity, religion, that they'll have to find, in a sense, a common thread politically to enable the sort of street protests, and of course, in so doing, challenge the traditional passivity of African electorates in the face of bad government. So yes, there must be a few leaders out there a little edgy about what's happened, but I don't think there are too many having sleepless nights in Sub-Saharan Africa. After all, the continent's just elected the president of Equatorial Guinea as president of the African Union. This is hardly a democratic regime, so I think the standards seem to be a little different.
Now, do you think that there is likely to be fundamental change in Egypt and other countries, or that after the current unrest there'll just be a return to business as usual?
Well, I guess the hope is that the economy will return to business as usual. It's a massively important economy, not just for North Africa and the Middle East, but for Sub-Saharan Africa. It's an 80 million person economy. It's relatively industrialized. It has a very big services sector. It's very important that to Sub-Saharan Africa, through its linkages through the Common Market for East and Southern Africa, COMESA, that Egypt retains its stability and is successful. The prospect of having an unstable Sudan and then bordering on it an unstable Egypt and then a sort of knock-on effect in the Middle Eastern region and North Africa is a tremendously threatening and potentially frightening concept. So one would hope that it would return, in a sense, economically to business as usual. How they address the expectations of the people that have pushed through these changes is going to be a very big challenge. As I've said, the Egyptian economy has been growing at 7% during the 2000s. How can they get to 10 or 15%, which seems to be what people want, is an enormous challenge. And I think that perhaps a more radical government will seek more radical solutions, and those radical solutions may be gratifying in the short term, but in the long term very damaging to the prospects of growth and sustainability of that growth in Egypt and in North Africa. Political ideologies have that attraction to people wanting quick fixes out of the difficult circumstances that they find themselves in. There are no quick fixes in economics. There may be in politics, but economics takes a lot longer. And one of the reasons why there's no quick fix in the case of Tunisia and Egypt is that one of the core problems in both societies is that these populations have grown tremendously over the last 50 years. Egypt's population has grown nearly fourfold over the last 50 years, from just over 20 million people to 83 million people today. It's very hard to provide for that enormous burgeoning number of young people in the society, who all are linked in by internet, possibly on this program, who tweeting, who blogging. There's been this Google executives linkage with the revolution in Egypt. It's very hard to meet their expectations in a short period of time without resorting to radical policies, because until now they have been very unhappy with what they've been given by pretty good policies in the case of Egypt in an economic sense. And the same applies to Tunisia, a population which has increased nearly threefold over the last 50 years. Again, people's expectations are informed by the world outside. Very difficult to meet those in the short term. Perhaps some of them will be met by the sense that they have a government which is more in tune with their issues, that their leadership is not 83 but maybe 50 or in their 40s perhaps, and understands the modern world. That's very important. But actually delivering on that promise is going to be far more complex and a far more problematic issue for any political leadership in North and in Sub-Saharan Africa.
And then finally, in your opinion, who do you think could take over the leadership of Egypt if Mubarak steps down?
Well, the multi-million-dollar question. I've not had experience of the future, unlike some pundits, but there's a great deal of sort of hindsight wisdom going around at the moment about Egypt. But I would be surprised if it wasn't somebody like Omar Suleiman, the intelligence chief, who's now the vice president. Somebody who has both the support of the security forces, but is seen to be a relatively modernizing figure. He may have been tainted by the fact that he is a sort of preferred candidate of the United States and of others, but he certainly is somebody who could provide both a measure of continuity but also a measure of change. It's not probably going to be Gamal Mubarak, Mr. Mubarak's preferred successor. He seems to be completely out of the picture now. And then from a democratic perspective, you'd have to say quite rightly so. But it does seem to be perhaps somebody from within the current environment, perhaps as a transitional figure. But the real question is transition to what and when? And what's that process going to look like? I mean, if the Muslim Brotherhood, and they're playing their cards pretty close to their chest at the moment, if they come into power, and if it's not an El-Baradei figure or a Suleiman figure, and if they come into power, I think you'll see a fairly dramatic change in Egyptian politics. And with that, you'll see the return of existentialist threats for Israel and potentially another armaments race in the region, and a change of in a sense, trajectory for the Middle East. Now, there's been peace between Israel and Egypt since 1978. It's been the bedrock on which any negotiations have taken place. As difficult and problem-ridden as those negotiations have been, that has been, in a sense, the cornerstone of the dialogues which have taken place, the ability to work through problems. If that was to change, I think all bets are off in terms of what happens with negotiations, what happens in terms of a military change of status quo in the Middle East. And that makes it even more dangerous place, an even more problematic and complex place. And I say is a return of the existentialist issues which faced Egypt, which in a sense ended after the 1973 war. And that, I think, would make things far more problematic for diplomats outside as well, and for statesmen outside and women outside, is to try to intervene in that very difficult, complex and volatile and heated environment. So there's a lot at stake which goes way beyond Egypt. And I hope too in this process that those encouraging this level of change don't encourage it and then walk away, that they encourage it and remain, in a sense, engaged with the issues that they have been a catalyst for and have seeded. It's very important that one doesn't create something and then watch it crash and burn down the road. It's very important for the region, for sub-Saharan Africa, and indeed for the prospects of peace in the sort of Mediterranean basin. So it's not just Egypt, it's not just Tunisia, it's a whole range of countries and in a sense generational concerns that we have riding on events in Egypt and earlier in Tunisia.